Well, thank you very much, and we continue this European Defense Summit now with an extended panel. It is my pleasure to bring on stage Benedikta von Seherr-Thoss, who is Managing Director for Peace, Security and Defense at the External Action Service, Jiří Šedivý, who is Chief Executive at the European Defense Agency, and Kevin Craven, who is CEO at EEAS. And as promised, Mr. Johansson stays with us because he always has something to say, so he continues. And on top of this wonderful panel, we are being joined through video conference, obviously because of the limitations when it comes to travel at times for Ukraine, and we are joined by the Ukrainian Minister for Strategic Industries, Oleksandr Kamyshin, who is with us now. Minister, thank you very much for joining us on this summit. I know you have a number of remarks that you want to make in terms of defense and the industrial capacity for Europe, but also the needs for Ukraine. I wonder, before we get into that, however, if you could give us just a very quick update about maybe the situation overall in Ukraine and how you see it, because there has been, as you know, a number of reports over the past weeks that the situation is looking worse, that the needs for the Ukrainian army are becoming even more and more stretched. And I wonder if you could give us perhaps a brief update as to what a real-time situation in your country is looking at as this war continues.
Hello, and thanks. Do you hear me well? All good?
Yes.
Okay, so I wouldn't speak much on the front line and on the situation generally. Actually, we're going through 784th day of the Great War, and it would be never easy at this point. And I'm responsible for defense industry, so I can speak for defense industry. First and foremost, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to the European community for all the support we have up to this point, and especially for the support in developing Ukraine's defense industry. This is crucial for us now, and we fight for our independence actually, and for existence as a nation, and for democratic values that you also uphold. Ukraine will become a member of the EU and NATO one day, and we are working to ensure that the Ukrainian defense industry also becomes part of the European defense industrial base. The integration of Ukraine's defense industry into European has already begun. Notably, in March, the European defense strategy was introduced, and it was the Russian aggression against Ukraine that spurred the EU to create the strategy for the first time in the history. We have become the part of the strategy, and there is a planned cooperation between the defense industries in Ukraine and Europe that will strengthen both sides and offer mutual benefits. For a long time, our defense industry was neglected. Now we are raising it from the ashes to the highest level, to the NATO standard. We are not competitors to your defense industries, but we are part of our mutual defense capabilities. We also have our own niche, a niche that is not particularly interesting for EU companies. We're able to make cheap, straightforward products that work, and we can scale up their production within weeks if we have a contract. Not a fighter jet, but 1 million of FPV drones. That's our niche. This is the best illustrated by our first self-propelled artillery unit, Bogdana. This is 155 millimeter caliber, NATO standard, and it's developed in Ukraine, and its final adjustments and tests were conducted on the battlefield under the full-scale invasion. It is a simple and relatively cheap system, but we're able to grow the production from zero, from scratch, to 6 units a month as of November last year, as my president said. This artillery was made immediately to a 155 millimeter caliber, the NATO standard. And I'm confident that Europe understands this. We see your support, your interest, and the first cases of collaboration between European enterprises and Ukrainian ones already happened. The first joint ventures between the state-owned enterprise Ukrbrunnprom and German conglomerate Rheinmetall has been established. We now have dozens of cooperation agreements between Ukraine and EU defense industry companies, which include licensed production, MRO, experience exchange, and joint production both in Ukraine and in other European countries. And this is just the beginning of our cooperation. We have much to offer our partners. We have the capabilities of our enterprises, our engineers, our iron people, and various cooperation options. We are improving our legislative framework and simplifying bureaucratic procedures to make it comfortable for the partners and investors to deal with us. And we are ready to consider each case individually and address specifically issues. However, we are hitting a financial ceiling. Our country is at war, and we face a challenging economic situation. The capabilities of our enterprises are already 3 times higher than our procurement budget. We have factories, people ready to work, and developments, but lack of funding. And this is why we call on our partners not only to create joint ventures, but bring funding to fund Ukrainian defense industry and buy weapons from the Ukrainian for the Ukrainian army within our country. We have developed developments that truly work on the front lines. Our manufacturers can offer highly competitive prices and quality products, and this can quickly reach the front line. European countries have agreed to supply Ukraine with 1 million drones. I urge you to buy these drones in Ukraine. Such cooperation is not about charity, it benefits everyone. We have a common enemy who will remain a threat even after our victory. The global community understands this and is beginning to invest money in defense. I urge you to invest in Ukrainian defense industry as part of our shared capabilities. And today, here I am pleased to announce that the first of those decisions already made. Yesterday, Denmark approved a new donation package for Ukraine. It allocates 200 million Danish kroner for financing weapons made in Ukraine. I expect this decision to be the first one of many others. I am grateful for this kind of leadership because Ukraine is the main military laboratory of the free world at this point, and nowhere else you can get the expertise like ours. Trends in the defense industry are currently emerging in Ukraine. Weapons of victory are being born here. Freedom must be better armed than tyranny, and only then we can maintain our independence and protect our partners. Let's build the arsenal of the free world together. Thank you.
Well, Minister, thank you so much. Well, thanks for that. Of course, that's Ukraine's Minister for Strategic Industries. And I wonder perhaps, let me start, of course, with you, because in some ways it is clear the journey that the EU has been on for the past 2 years is enormous. If you go back to just the day when the peace facility gets announced, to the magnitude, the extent, he also recognized it, too, in terms of this funding, continuous funding that we've seen. But we've also heard from defense players, the Ukrainian government at times saying it's just not enough, however, to maybe win a war, and it's going too much in a trickle-down way, perhaps. They obviously are fighting a war, they want to see more, and they want to see it faster too, but the industry also has an interest. So I wonder, first, if we could just take stock of everything that's happened, how you see the EU being a defense player at this stage, but also fundamentally the big question that matters is, what happens next?
Thank you very much. I would say that the EU's support to Ukraine really has been a game changer in the EU's approach. If we think back only, I would say, a bit more than 2 years ago, it would have been unthinkable for the EU to support the delivery of military equipment to crisis countries, let alone to weapons to partners at war. So that really is a change. And also, you talked about the magnitude. So far, EU member states have provided weapons worth 31 billion euros to Ukraine. Of course, a lot is needed, but I think we also need to see where have we come from and what has happened, and that really is considerable. We have the European Peace Facility, which is the fund which we are using to basically co-finance the delivery of weapons that member states do. And member states have agreed just last month to add another 5 billion to this fund, which is now 17 billion. Over 11 billion dedicated to Ukraine, so that will help us do much more also in the future. And I will open a small bracket because you asked what has been done so far. Of course, it's about delivering equipment, but it's also about training Ukrainian soldiers. The EU so far has trained 43,000 soldiers, and the aim is to train 60,000 by summer. The minister has already mentioned quite a few topics. The goal, of course, is to integrate Ukraine into the EDTIB in the long term. The goal is to support the build-up of Ukrainian armed forces in the long run, and there we are cooperating closely and coordinating closely with the UDCG, the Rammstein format, which means it's of course an American-led initiative which brings many partners to the table, and the aim is to follow the same plan to see what does Ukraine need and how can we all contribute to building up the armed forces. And what we need is not just, there are basically 3 tracks, right? We need to look at all parts of the production cycle. We need to deliver from existing stocks. We need to place more orders. But in order to get what we have ordered, we also need to ramp up industry and to enable industry to actually produce what is needed. And that goes for our European industry, but that also, of course, goes for the Ukrainian industry, because what we want is not just to continue donating, as the minister said, but also to enable the Ukrainian defense industry to produce themselves. So we have published the European Defense Industrial Strategy, which aims at tackling lots of different parts of this process, and which integrates basically Ukraine almost as an EU member state when it comes to supporting industry and supporting also joint ventures between Europe and Ukraine. And we have an industry forum that the EEAS organizes together with the Commission and Ukraine, where we will, on the 6th of May, bring together the political level, but also we will do some kind of matchmaking between companies to basically enable cooperation between the two. And funding is another important one, so there are different ideas on the table. I mentioned the European Peace Facility or the Ukraine Assistance Fund, as we call the specific Ukraine part. And then we are looking also into using windfall profits. And of course, there are also other initiatives on the table, like changing the EIB landing policy, etc. So.
Can I ask you, can I ask you on that front, because you mentioned something important, which is the consensus until now to get these things going, but we have seen, and perhaps this is my perception, but I wonder what you think, that the top-ups, however, going now the extra mile, gathering this consensus, it is becoming at times politically very difficult among member states. Obviously, there's a question mark around the European elections and what some parties that are involved think about Ukraine and helping Ukraine, but also even in areas where there is consensus. Obviously, you mentioned the windfall tax. Technically, we see that a number of countries that may be inclined to help Ukraine do worry, however, about the structure of a lot of these new initiatives. So what type of political consensus do you see building, especially in an election year? It looks very difficult from the outside.
We have 27 member states, so building consensus is in the nature of our work. And of course, it's very difficult to, it's a challenge if the more money is spent, the better it has to be explained. So of course, it's always a challenge to do that. So far, we have had really remarkable consensus. Yes, there are problems, and yes, there will be problems. So what we do is we try to overcome them as we basically cross every bridge as we get to it. In the end, I think, like always, it depends on the political will. It depends on how well we explain it to our populations that we actually have to invest in our freedom, democracy, that I mean, we are helping Ukraine, yes, but we are also helping ourselves. So it's very important that Ukraine wins that war. And we know that it's a very difficult situation right now. So I think it's about the awareness that it's important to support really Ukraine with whatever we can. That was also a statement in the last European councils. That takes a lot of, we need to have the programs in place on the international side, but we also, of course, need political consensus and consensus of the populations, with the populations of the member states. You mentioned the elections, so of course that will come up. So it's to explain what does the war have to do with us? Why are we concerned immediately? And of course, I mean, we working on Ukraine every day. We understand it very well, but someone who's in a geographically more removed, who has a very different job, who doesn't deal with it every day and just hears it through the news, might not feel this direct involvement. So it's really that we have to forge this consensus, and that we need to have a very good communication and explain it well.
Well, thank you for that. And to be clear, when we say the windfall tax, we mean the revenue off, which Belgium is a key player, just to be very precise on that point. Mr. Šedivý, I wonder, what is your take perhaps from kind of a more hands-on perspective? I mean, you're making some of the things that we have referenced in these panels. Do you feel there's this political will to create this truly innovative but also strong defense industry? Is it something that you now believe can be translated from paper into reality? Are you more optimistic than you were a year ago?
Thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you for invitation. No, I see the political will, indeed, also supported by the public. And I just read the very last April Eurobarometer, which is in view of the incoming elections to the European Parliament, and the voters across Europe see defense as one of the key priorities, and this is growing, and this is going to stay with us. And notwithstanding now what will be the outcome of the situation in our eastern neighborhood. We have also southern neighborhoods now, and which, for example, the US allies see as our own backyard, where we should be able to act and stabilize. I'm speaking about, above all, we see the situation in the Middle East, but Africa, Sahel, Sub-Saharan Africa, etc. So the contested security environment is going to stay with us, and I'm afraid is going even deteriorate into the future. First, second, our citizens expect us from the European Union level of defense cooperation to provide stability, security to their way of life, and protect our values. So I believe that actually we are still perhaps at the beginning of a longer mid to long-term process of a consolidation of European defense capabilities, which is important, indeed supported by resilient European defense technological industrial base.
And do you believe, as is the hope of some and the bet of others, that this new commission that will take place, whoever the head of the commission is, but assuming it is the current head and Ursula von der Leyen stays, she's already talked about this EU defense commissioner and so on, that you're going to see a material pivot into defense, but also, as I asked Mr. Johansson, when we talk about material pivot into defense, how much money are we talking about? Because ultimately we'll come down to funding. Who's going to underwrite all of these projects?
Perhaps first we should set our level of ambition, and from that level of ambition to derive various options of funding. but indeed, at the minimum, in order to really make change, we would need the orders that Micael mentioned over a mid to long-term financial prospect, which so we are speaking in terms of that were mentioned. But what is important also is to keep in mind that the new funds are well managed and invested into relevant capabilities. And in that respect, we know what we need. We know what we have strategic compass, which was mentioned also by the Belgian minister. At the European Defence Agency, we have developed with the member states capability development plan or European capability priorities approved by the defense ministers in November last year. We have therefore a clear sort of a roadmap in terms of priorities in the short, mid, but long term, and we are looking beyond 2030. Yeah.
And thank you for that. Mr. Craven, what is your institution, what role can it play in this? Because we're now talking about European defense, and to be clear, that's not just the EU, but Europe, it's an entire continent, and players like the UK in a number of areas are still strategically very, very important. And then secondly, and in fact, there's even talk that this partnership will have to be strengthened between the two, despite Brexit and everything that came along with it. But also, can I just ask you, because we've already heard twice on this panel the idea of the long-term contracts. Can we just get a sense of what is an ideal contract for you? Obviously, everyone here is in it to make money. We know that. But ultimately, there's also an operational side of things. What is an ideal contract? What is the length? What are we talking about?
Thank you, and it's great to be here with you. And look, I would say, of course, the UK is part of Europe geographically and culturally. Politically, perhaps not at the moment, but we are very keen to stand with Europe in the fight against Russia that is happening in Ukraine. I was in Kiev last week with a British trade mission, 29 companies, and we were looking at a number of the things the minister spoke about in terms of building factories in Ukraine, joint ventures for technology transfer, and for improving Ukraine's own capability to defend itself, as well as looking at possible export opportunities. In terms of the question you asked, contract and what would look ideal, certainty is the bedrock of all industries, including the defense sector, and therefore orders that are always on rather than a surge is the best type of order to receive. And in an ideal world, that would be for an evolving capability. The pace of technology improvement in military tactics and doctrine means that placing an order for a piece of equipment that would remain the same for the next 10 years is not credible any longer. So there has to be a flexible, agile arrangement. In terms of size, we all know that 2% is a target, is the floor for NATO expenditure in terms of a country's GDP. UK, we're at 2.2%. It is not enough for our own needs, yet alone in terms of supporting the wider world.
And can I ask a follow-up question? I really didn't want to get into the politics, but since you mentioned the UK, yes, geographically, as far as we all know, is still in Europe. Politically, you said maybe not for the time being, but without getting into really a conversation about this, however, there has been a debate, especially there's an election year in the UK. Some say there will be a change in government, and I'm not sure if that affects you or not, or you even want to comment on that. But there has been a debate that perhaps we should see a much bigger collaboration between ministers on both sides, and that perhaps you should get UK representatives coming to meetings that happen in Brussels with, you know, the industry, with defense ministers and on, and maybe vice versa. Obviously, some of the European players will say European contracts are for EU members. But beyond that, do you believe there is a case for a stronger collaboration?
There is absolutely a stronger case for collaboration, particularly in the defense and security area. We genuinely believe that Europe is stronger with the industrial capacity and capability of the UK. I represent some 1,300 members, 23 billion of euros, of 23 billion of revenues, and approximately 147,000 people in the defense industries in the UK. That is around a third of the industrial capacity in Europe, and we should not ignore that. So I do believe there is room politically for and militarily for cooperation around the defense of Europe through the channel of NATO, if it must be, but beyond that I think is important as well.
And perhaps a question for the three of you, and I wonder, not to be too controversial, but it's out there and we should mention it. When it comes to the European defense industry, some say that the US election is the biggest external factor perhaps that could alter the pace, but also this political will that you talk about. I wonder what happens if there's a Trump win, what happens if there's a Biden win? Is that something that you factor in? The reason why I ask is because some say maybe you do need that kind of externality that puts you on the brink at times to get things moving faster. So who wants to take this question?
I'm happy to start. Of course, it will make a huge difference who will be the US president. At the same time, the question that we as Europeans have to ask ourselves, how dependent do we want to be with our own security? I give you a few numbers. We in the EU get 78% of our defense capabilities from outside the EU. I think that's a huge political problem because it means that we have a huge security dependency on outside actors.
And individually also, buying countries individually, countries. That's what came up, that a lot of them were placing orders on a national basis with very little coordination.
That's yet another issue. Of course, the fragmentation of the defense industry and the way we are organized internally. There are estimates that we can save around 1/3, if not half, of the defense spending if we spend it together and wisely. But I want to concentrate on the fact that Europe at the moment is really hugely dependent with its security, and that goes for political terms, but I want to concentrate on the capabilities only. So the question is, we are, our security is dependent on others. But it's also about technology, high technology. To what extent do we want to be dependent, and or to what extent do we want to be able to develop the capabilities that we need ourselves? And I would say it has to be higher than 70 or than, 22%. I think that's a fundamental question that we have to ask ourselves. To what extent do we want to be responsible for our own security? And I think that with Trump or without Trump, we have to do much more. I think there has been a certain amount of Zeitenwende, and this has trickled down partially, but I think that still much more needs to be done, and then we need to see, in what ways can we do it. We have a target of doing 35% jointly. At the moment, we are at 18%. And we are, from the EU side, trying to set incentives and do different things to encourage cooperation. But I think it really starts, as I said in my first remark, with the awareness of where are we and where do we want to get to.
Well, thank you for that, a response to this. And the number is, to some extent, stunning. I mean, she says 78%. Obviously, you're European CEOs. Does this make any sense to you?
No, I completely support the fact that we have, independently of what's happening in the US, we have to take a bigger responsibility in terms of spending money on European defense industry, rather than buying too much abroad. So, I mean, we don't really have a level playing field here. We have a strong FMS competition in terms of having a country, the State Department, supporting much more than buying equipment and systems. And that is difficult for countries and politicians to manage, I think. But back to the fact that we still spend money on developing rather sophisticated capabilities, and we have great defense industries in Europe, but we tend to forget that we have to have the capacity as well and the production capacity. So we sort of still go and buy volumes, which, of course, for years to come then will mean that there's no need for capacity and volumes in the defense industry in Europe, and we can't have it that way. This needs to change the balance. This will take time, but the big thing is, of course, if Trump comes into power now, I mean, industrial leader, that will mean, of course, that the urgency of stepping up will become much more at stake for us, because if it means that the support of Ukraine will diminish or disappear, we have an urgent situation to be much more capable in Europe to continue the support. That will be the big thing, I think, going forward.
Because you have to fill the gap.
We have to fill the gap, absolutely. So we don't have any time. We need to run fast now.
And additions to this part? I mean,
I cannot agree more than with Benedikta and with Micael, and I would also add just the remark that notwithstanding who ends up in the White House after the elections, European Union should strive for more autonomous capacities to act, including actually aiming towards the direction of strategic autonomy. It's clear. And this indeed...
What does that mean to you, this idea of strategic autonomy? Because you ask every 3 people and they tell you something completely different. From a defense perspective,
From the defense
what does that mean? Because some people say the French like it because it means more companies, more contracts for my industry. So what does that mean to you? And is there a case that it's not just good for the French, it works for everyone? What does it mean?
No, it's nothing against the transatlantic link or the US. It's just the capacity to act in strategic situations where NATO and or US will simply not be involved in the future. And I mentioned it before that actually we don't have only eastern neighborhood, we have also southern neighborhood. And indeed this strategic autonomy should be supported, first of all, by the political will. That's a very important starting point. But at the same time, and we are working on that already, more autonomous capabilities with, I would say, fuller spectrum, higher end, ready for higher intensity operations, and indeed, last but not least, with more autonomous and resilient European defense industrial base to support that. And indeed, we should strive to change that export-import balance or imbalance that was mentioned already.
Well, thank you for that. Just very quickly, Mr. Craven, if you want, and then we'll go back to you.
So, look, it is clear that Europe must have its own defense capability and capacity to protect itself. In the future, no one else will. And we are strongly supportive of the steps Europe is taking to build a defense industrial strategy and the funding to support that capability in the future. But we also need to cooperate, both from a military point of view in terms of interoperability, but also from an industrial capacity point of view. And in building that European industrial base, we would urge that there are not barriers put in place that prevent cooperation with friends and allies like the UK.
And you make that very clear. Before we go to Mr. Johansson, if I could just go to Benedikta, because I saw that you were nodding and you wanted to elaborate, so...
I think that it's really about European security and transatlantic security, and it's about finding solutions that help us get there. And we have now talked a lot about what the EU can do. I think in the end we need to throw basically every solution that we have at the problem. What we have seen, the lessons from the Russian war in Ukraine, that we don't have enough capabilities to supply Ukraine. Ammunition is a very good example for that. We don't have enough capabilities to defend Europe. You just need to look at the discussions at NATO, and we haven't mentioned NATO so far, who's of course very important. If you look at the discussions within the alliance on capability targets, then we see that there is really a big problem. And we know that the capabilities, the word interoperability was just mentioned, don't speak to each other enough. So standardization is yet another huge problem that we need to tackle. It's already a huge problem for Ukraine, but if you translate that into a high-intensity warfare to defend, for example, Europe on a larger scale, this would prove really difficult. So in the end, I think we have to be very pragmatic, and we have to enable the different European countries, whether they are EU member states or NATO allies, to acquire more capabilities and do it in a way that is wiser than we do it at the moment, which is very fragmented. So that's why we have the different programs, and I think this is also where EU and NATO fit perfectly together, because NATO will be much stronger if it has allies who actually have the capabilities that we need. So in the end, I think it's really about empowering these member states, and there the EU can contribute a lot. And I mentioned standardization. I think there are different prejudices out there. For example, the EU will now start developing its own standards. We are not. To the contrary, we are taking the NATO standards that are being used as far as they are accessible. And that is something that the EU is very good at, right? To help implement standards and follow standards, and that is also something that we mentioned in the defense industrial strategy. So I think the more we enable the European countries, the more it will help European security, but it also, and that is a very important message to whatever administration in the US, it means that the US will have a strong partner, a strong European partner. So I think, and we have to also be very clear about who are the real adversaries. Are they, should we compete with each other? Or should we not be very clear that the real problems are outside the transatlantic area, and that it would be good to have two very strong partners being able to cooperate on, I would say, also potentially other parts of the globe?
Yes, and indeed, we haven't even mentioned China so far on this panel, speaking of that. But I wonder, Mr. Johansson, I know you wanted to add something, but I also, and this is a hard question, but since we hear we're not ready, we need to, and projecting all of these ideas in the future, can you just give us a number in terms of how war ready is actually Europe or the EU? If you were to put it on a scale, would you say we're 40% ready, we're 60%, we're even less, and I'm very worried? How would you place it on a scale?
On a scale of what?
On a scale of, let's put it on 100%, mean tomorrow you're completely war ready and you have what you need, but today is today, so what would that percentage look like? Just so we get an idea of how you see this gap in real life.
I think the gap is quite big, but it depends on what kind of area you're talking about. I mean, take for example our capabilities in the air domain. I think it's fascinating and good that we have different type of fighter systems that can actually act together in the context of NATO. That will be a big threat to our aggressors, that we have different submarine capabilities. So we are good at certain things, but obviously we don't have the capacity on ammunitions and weapon systems and air defense systems. We don't have the dome capability that you've seen now in Israel that we really need. What I wanted to add before is I think we have to sort out something. We talk about this incentive funds in EU, and I really like that sort of direction. And who can access these money? And how do we look upon this strategic autonomy or open strategic autonomy? We need to think about it the same way a little bit that the US does. I mean, if you want to be on that market, you have to be local. I have no problems having US companies establishing themselves being competitive in Europe, and UK companies for that sake, or other companies, as long as we have the design authority and some sort of reasonable content in the supply chain and ecosystem to be sovereign in terms of capabilities. It's the same view in the US. We can't just say that sort of owned companies by US companies cannot sort of access money or be part of this collaboration. If you have them here, as we are establishing ourselves in the US the same way, that would work. We need that competition, we need them here, but we can't be dependent on what's happening on another continent to the extent we are today. And that's my perspective of this.
So when you had your meeting, because I know you had with a number of, I believe, 7 other European companies were represented with Breton and Micael, and you wanted to this closed-door meeting, then that's probably what you told them. So what did they respond?
I think the view today is maybe too much on who controls what these companies, what they do, and what they can or cannot do in Europe. From the other side of the Atlantic. And that's kind of important, and we have that same thing in the US. You work under some sort of special security agreement if you establish yourself there, and we can establish the same thing here. But we want them here, we want that capability here, but they have to be rather close to us in an ecosystem. That's my perspective from the industry side, that we create edge as well.
And we're running out of time, I'm being told, so I want to use the final maybe 4 minutes, so that means a minute for all of you, but perhaps your final remarks, just final thought before we wrap the session. We've touched upon a lot of themes, but I wonder perhaps if we start with you, Benedikta, and just your final wrap at 1 minute. It's a challenge, I know, but...
Okay, 1 minute wrap up.
Give or take.
I think it's really about awareness to know where we want to go, awareness at the political level. It's about providing the right programs from our side. On Monday we will have a ministers meeting, a jumbo meeting of both foreign ministers and defense ministers, and they will talk again about, we will have a 3-hour session on Ukraine alone and how can we support Ukraine better. So it's about awareness and ideas, but also implementing these ideas. That will be an important step. Then I already mentioned the industry forum that we have on the 6th of May, where we will concretely see how can we bring industry together and how can we match that with funding. So yes, immense sums are needed. We are providing already very big sums, but still more is needed. So we're looking into how can we spend wisely what we have. UAF, so the peace facility money, but also, for example, windfall profits, EIB, and then there are, of course, other ideas out there on Eurobonds, etc.
Yes.
So I think it will be very important if we look further ahead into the next MFF, the decision of European leaders, how much money do they want to put into the EU budget. There are many ideas out there, and I think it has to be much more than what we have currently. But it's, again, not only how much do we have, but also how do we spend it. And I think the more we spend together and the less fragmented we are, the more we will get out of the money.
Well, thank you very much. So perhaps 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Perhaps I will formulate 4 lessons learned from the war in Ukraine. The first one is that the quantity, the mass matters. We see it clearly, never underestimate Russia. At the same time, also quality matters in terms of very remarkable and admirable way how Ukrainians are counterbalancing the mass with innovation in various areas, command and control, targeting, but, and this was mentioned already, flexible logistics. It's a logistics challenge, I would say unprecedented, because Ukrainians are operating a wide variety of various systems of various origins and indeed also generations. And to actually do this. It's really unprecedented, which leads me to a point which was already mentioned by Benedikta, and it's about standardization, interchangeability, interoperability. Therefore, we at the European Defence Agency experience this when we are procuring 155 ammunition for 4 types of EU member states made artillery systems, and we see that it's 155 millimeters, but that actually is not one size fits all. And very last, an important lesson learned, it is extremely difficult to ramp up with the industrial capacity and production after decades of underspending.
Thank you for that. Sir?
So I'll be short. The Ukrainians have a phrase, the fight tonight. They are dying at the moment, so we need to be urgent in terms of what we do. But I would emphasize 3 things. Production, I repeat that. It is desperately important we increase our capacity and our production rates in the defense industry now. Investment, we have to create the climate where our politicians and our societies support the need for an always-on defense industry. It is really important that we have the capacity and the capability to respond to aggressors. And then finally, cooperation, both militarily, industrially, politically. We need to work together. No single country can afford the defense capabilities it needs to protect itself. It will only happen through a coalition of allies and willing industries.
Thank you for that. And Mr. Johansson, you have the final word.
I think I've said a lot, but let's go back to what Minister Kamyshin talked about and how important. My frustration today is that, and maybe it's just us as an industry, but I want to create sort of a channel of support directly with the Ukrainian MOD and the Ukrainian Defense Forces. That's incredibly difficult in terms of financing, but also who do you work with, how do you establish support, as we talked about, in country, and that has to develop. I think we have to learn a bit from each other, I think industry-wise, how to do that, but we need some sort of authority, governmental support to establish that, because it has to work that way going forward. We can't just continue to donate and so forth. That's where my frustration is right now.
The no direct channel. Well, thank you for that. Thank you very much. There is a coffee break. I ate a few minutes into it, but hopefully it was worth it. And then on that note, a round of applause to all of you for taking all of my questions. Thank you very much.